The most devastating flood of 1937 that drowned the Ohio Valley and challenged all of America. It was a morning like any other. January 10th, 1937. The people of the Ohio Valley woke to the sound of rain tapping against their windows. Farmers in Kentucky poured their coffee and watched the gray sky, thinking little of the drizzle. Factory workers in Cincinnati pulled on their coats and headed to the mills. Mothers in Louisville packed lunches for their children, kissed them goodbye, and sent them off to school. No one knew. No one could have known. In just a few days, the rivers they had lived beside for generations would rise with a fury no one had ever witnessed. The rain that seemed so ordinary that morning would not stop for weeks, and before it was over, more than 1 million Americans would lose their homes. Entire cities would vanish beneath walls of muddy water. The death toll would climb into the hundreds, and a nation still struggling through the Great Depression would face a new kind of reckoning. This is the story of the most devastating flood of 1937, the flood that drowned the Ohio Valley and challenged all of America. Chapter 1. The rain that would not stop. The Ohio River stretches for nearly 1,000 miles, winding through 6 states from Pittsburgh to Cairo, where it meets the Mississippi. For centuries, the river had been the lifeblood of the region. It carried goods and people. It powered industries. It shaped the identity of every town along its banks. The people of the Ohio Valley understood the river. They respected it. They knew it could rise in the spring when the snow melted. They knew it could swell after heavy rains. But they also believed they had learned to live with it. They had built levees. They had raised their homes on higher ground. They had survived floods before. 1913, 1924. Each time, the water came and went, and life resumed. They had no reason to believe 1937 would be any different. The first rains arrived in early January, light at first, almost gentle. The Ohio Valley was no stranger to winter storms, and the early showers seemed unremarkable. But the rain did not stop. Day after day, the clouds hung low and heavy over the valley. The drizzle became a downpour. The downpour became relentless. By the second week of January, the ground was saturated. The creeks and streams that fed into the Ohio began to swell. The river itself started to rise. In Cincinnati, the river gauge at the public landing showed a steady climb. On January 14th, the water stood at 35 feet. By the 17th, it had reached 40 feet. The flood stage for Cincinnati was 52 feet. City officials watched the numbers with growing concern, but many residents remained calm. They had seen high water before. They trusted the levees. They believed the rain would stop. But the rain did not stop. It fell in sheets across the entire Ohio Valley, from the mountains of West Virginia to the plains of Indiana. It fell on Pittsburgh and Wheeling, on Huntington and Portsmouth, on Louisville and Evansville. Every tributary, every creek, every stream added its burden to the swelling Ohio. The river became a living thing, rising with a terrible patience, swallowing everything in its path. In the small town of Shawneetown, Illinois, an elderly woman named Martha Jennings watched the water creep toward her front porch. She had lived in that house for 47 years. She had raised 6 children there. She had buried her husband from that front room. The house stood just 3 blocks from the riverbank, on what everyone called the high ground. In 1913, the water had come within a foot of her door. She had stayed then. She would stay now. Her neighbors urged her to leave, but Martha shook her head. She said the Lord would protect her. She said she had seen floods before. She said the water always went down. By January 20th, the river at Cincinnati reached 50 feet, 2 feet below flood stage. The rain continued. In the hills of eastern Kentucky, entire communities were already underwater. Roads had become rivers. Bridges had washed away. Families huddled on rooftops waiting for rescue that might never come. The telegraph lines went down. The telephone lines went silent. Towns that had been connected to the outside world for decades suddenly found themselves utterly alone. The people of Louisville watched the rising water with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Louisville sat at a bend in the Ohio, where the river widened before plunging over the Falls of the Ohio, a series of rapids that had shaped the city's history. The falls had made Louisville a natural stopping point for river traffic, a place where goods had to be unloaded and carried around the rapids. The city had grown wealthy on that geography, but that same geography now made it vulnerable. The bend in the river acted like a funnel, concentrating the floodwaters and pushing them higher against the city's defenses. On January 21st, the river at Louisville reached 46 feet. Flood stage was 28 feet. The water was already 18 feet above normal and still rising. The city's mayor, Neville Miller, declared a state of emergency. He ordered the evacuation of low-lying neighborhoods. He called for volunteers to fill sandbags and reinforce the levees. He sent urgent telegrams to Washington, pleading for federal assistance. But even as he took these measures, Mayor Miller knew they might not be enough. The rain showed no sign of stopping, and the river kept rising. In the working-class neighborhood of Portland, on Louisville's west side, a young mother named Helen Cartwright gathered her 3 children and prepared to leave her home. Her husband Thomas worked at a furniture factory near the river. He had left for work that morning, promising to return by noon. But noon came and went, and Thomas did not appear. The streets outside were filling with water. Helen could hear the shouts of neighbors, the cries of children, the desperate barking of dogs. She wrapped her youngest, a baby girl named Dorothy, in a blanket and led her 2 sons, James and William, toward the door. She did not know where she would go. She only knew she could not stay. The water reached Helen's porch just as she stepped outside. It was cold, shockingly cold, and it moved with a current stronger than she had expected. She held Dorothy tight against her chest and gripped William's hand. James, who was 10, walked ahead, testing each step. The water was already knee-deep in the street. Helen looked back at her house, at the home she and Thomas had built together, and felt something break inside her. She did not know if she would ever see it again. Across the river in Indiana, the town of Jeffersonville was disappearing. The water had overwhelmed the levees during the night, pouring through breaches and spreading across the lowlands with terrifying speed. Families who had gone to bed believing they were safe woke to find water in their bedrooms. Some escaped to their attics, others climbed onto their roofs. A few, the unlucky ones, did not wake at all. A factory foreman named George Sullivan had been working the night shift when the levee broke. He heard the roar first, a sound like distant thunder that grew louder and closer. Then he saw the wall of water coming through the darkness, carrying debris and wreckage, moving faster than a man could run. George shouted a warning to his co-workers and sprinted for the stairwell. He reached the 2nd floor just as the water crashed through the factory doors, smashing machinery and sweeping away everything in its path. George and a dozen other workers spent the night huddled on the factory's upper floor, listening to the water rage below, praying for dawn. By January 22nd, the situation had become catastrophic. The river at Cincinnati reached 52 feet, flood stage, but the water did not stop there. It kept climbing, inch by inch, hour by hour, pushing past every prediction, defying every expectation. The levees that had protected the city for decades began to fail. Water poured through cracks and seams, undermining foundations, collapsing walls. Entire neighborhoods that had never flooded before suddenly found themselves underwater. The city's water treatment plant, located on the riverbank, was overwhelmed. The pumps that supplied clean water to hundreds of thousands of residents sputtered and died. Within hours, Cincinnati's taps ran dry. A city of nearly 500,000 people was suddenly without drinking water. The risk of disease, already high, became critical. Health officials warned of typhoid, of dysentery, of cholera. They urged residents to boil any water they could find, but many residents had no way to boil water. Their homes were flooded. Their stoves were useless. They had nothing. The Red Cross mobilized with unprecedented speed. Volunteers from across the country poured into the Ohio Valley, bringing food, clothing, medicine, and hope. Temporary shelters were established in schools, churches, and public buildings. Rescue boats patrolled the flooded streets, pulling survivors from rooftops and upper-story windows. Radio stations broadcast urgent appeals for assistance, and Americans from every state responded with donations and prayers. But even as the rescue efforts intensified, the river continued to rise. On January 24th, it reached 79.9 feet at Cincinnati, the highest level ever recorded. The city was drowning. More than 200,000 residents had been driven from their homes. Entire neighborhoods had become lakes. The waterfront district, the heart of the city's commerce, lay under 20 feet of water. The cost in property and lives was incalculable, and still, the rain fell. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If stories of human endurance and forgotten history move you, if you want to witness how ordinary people faced extraordinary challenges, then this is where you belong. Subscribe now, because every story we tell is a piece of our shared memory, and you deserve to be part of it. Chapter 2. The Cities Beneath the Water. By the last week of January, the Ohio River had become something no one recognized. It was no longer a river at all, but an inland sea stretching for miles in every direction, swallowing farms and factories, homes and highways, everything that stood in its path. The flood had become the largest natural disaster in American history, affecting a region that stretched from Pittsburgh to the Mississippi. Louisville suffered more than any other city. The river there crested at 57.1 feet on January 27th, nearly 30 feet above flood stage. 70% of the city was underwater. More than 230,000 people, nearly the entire population, had been evacuated or displaced. The city's downtown, its commercial heart, lay submerged. Water stood 20 feet deep on 4th Street, the main thoroughfare. The Brown Hotel, one of the city's grandest landmarks, became an island surrounded by a sea of muddy brown water. The human cost was staggering. In Louisville alone, 90 people lost their lives to the flood. Some drowned in their homes, unable to escape the rising water. Others perished from exposure, stranded on rooftops or in attics without food or warmth. Still others succumbed to disease in the overcrowded shelters, their bodies weakened by cold and hunger and despair. Mayor Neville Miller worked without sleep for days, coordinating rescue efforts, managing supplies and pleading for federal help. He commandeered every boat he could find, from pleasure craft to industrial barges, and sent them into the flooded streets to search for survivors. He ordered the National Guard to patrol the evacuated neighborhoods, protecting property from looters and ensuring that no one was left behind. He broadcast hourly updates on the radio, his voice hoarse but steady, urging calm and offering hope. But even Miller knew that hope was in short supply. The city's infrastructure had collapsed. The water system was destroyed. The sewer system had failed, sending raw sewage into the floodwaters and creating a breeding ground for disease. The electrical grid was down across most of the city. Telephone service was sporadic at best. The streets, those that remained above water, were choked with refugees and debris. In the neighborhood of Butchertown, one of Louisville's oldest communities, an elderly butcher named Anton Brower refused to leave his shop. Anton had immigrated from Germany as a young man and had spent 50 years building his business. His shop stood on a small rise, slightly higher than the surrounding streets, and Anton believed it would be safe. He sent his wife and grown children to higher ground, but he himself stayed behind to protect his property. For 3 days, Anton lived alone in his shop, watching the water rise around him. He moved his inventory to the upper shelves. He pushed his equipment to the highest points. He slept on the counter, wrapped in butcher's paper, listening to the water lap against his door. On the 4th day, the water finally reached his threshold. Anton stood at his front window and watched it pour across his floor, brown and cold and relentless. He felt something inside him collapse, not fear exactly, but something deeper, a kind of surrender. He had fought all his life. He had survived war and poverty and immigration, but he could not fight the river. No one could. Anton was rescued the next morning by a National Guard boat. The soldiers found him sitting on his counter, his feet dangling in the water, his eyes staring at nothing. He had lost everything. His inventory was ruined, his equipment was destroyed. His shop, the work of 50 years, would never reopen. But Anton was alive. And in those terrible days, survival was the only victory that mattered. The stories multiplied across the flooded region, each one a testament to human resilience and human loss. In Paducah, Kentucky, the entire city was evacuated, all 33,000 residents driven from their homes by the rising water. The city's mayor, E. Bell, commandeered a fleet of boats and personally led rescue missions into the flooded neighborhoods. He worked for 72 hours without rest, pulling families from rooftops and attics, carrying children through chest-deep water, refusing to stop until every resident was safe. In Evansville, Indiana, the river crested at 53.7 feet, nearly 25 feet above flood stage. The city's African-American community, segregated into the low-lying Lincoln Gardens neighborhood, bore the brunt of the flooding. Families who had already endured the hardships of the Depression now faced a new crisis. Their homes were destroyed. Their possessions were swept away. They were crowded into makeshift shelters, separated from their white neighbors, given the poorest supplies and the least attention. A young schoolteacher named Ida Mae Robinson worked tirelessly in the Lincoln Gardens shelter, caring for children who had been separated from their parents, comforting elderly residents who had lost everything, organizing supplies and distributing food. Ida Mae had grown up in that neighborhood. She had attended Lincoln School, where she now taught 3rd grade. She knew every family, every child, every story, and she refused to let her community be forgotten. Ida Mae wrote letters to newspapers across the country, describing the conditions in Lincoln Gardens and pleading for assistance. She spoke on the radio, her voice calm but insistent, demanding that the Red Cross provide equal aid to all flood victims, regardless of race. She organized volunteers from her church to visit every shelter in the city, ensuring that African American families received the help they needed. Her efforts drew national attention and helped shame relief agencies into providing more equitable assistance. But even as communities organized and volunteers mobilized, the scale of the disaster threatened to overwhelm all efforts. The Ohio Valley flood of 1937 eventually affected more than 1 million people across 12 states. It caused more than $500 million in property damage, the equivalent of nearly $10 billion today. It killed at least 385 people, though the true death toll was certainly higher, as many victims were never recovered from the floodwaters. The flood also exposed the inadequacy of the nation's disaster preparedness. Despite decades of flooding on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, there was no coordinated federal response system. Relief efforts depended on the Red Cross, on state and local governments, on the goodwill of ordinary citizens. The federal government, still mired in the bureaucracy of the New Deal, was slow to respond. President Franklin Roosevelt eventually declared the flood a national emergency and authorized federal aid, but the assistance came too late for many victims. In Portsmouth, Ohio, a river town of 40,000 people, the levee failed on January 25th, sending a wall of water through the downtown district. The city's main street became a river. Businesses that had operated for generations were destroyed in minutes. The town's hospital was flooded, forcing the evacuation of patients to higher ground. A nurse named Clara Henderson carried an infant up 3 flights of stairs, the water rising behind her with every step, and reached safety just as the first floor was completely submerged. Clara later said she did not feel heroic. She said she felt only a kind of desperate determination, a refusal to let the water win. That determination, repeated thousands of times across the flooded region, became the defining characteristic of the response. Ordinary people, faced with extraordinary circumstances, discovered reserves of courage and compassion they never knew they possessed. The floodwaters began to recede in early February, revealing a landscape of devastation that defied comprehension. Houses had been torn from their foundations and carried miles downstream. Automobiles were buried in mud up to their rooftops. Dead livestock floated in fields that had once been pastures. The smell of decay hung over the valley, a constant reminder of all that had been lost. The cleanup would take months. The recovery would take years. Many communities would never fully rebuild. Some residents who had evacuated simply never returned, choosing to start new lives in cities that did not sit beside the river. The flood had broken something in them, some faith in the land that had sustained their families for generations. But even as the waters receded, even as the full scope of the tragedy became clear, the people of the Ohio Valley began to rebuild. They shoveled mud from their homes. They salvaged what possessions they could. They planted gardens in soil that had been scoured by the flood. They reopened schools and churches and businesses. They refused to be defeated. Chapter 3. The Weight of Memory. The days after the flood were days of mourning and reckoning. Families who had been separated during the evacuation searched desperately for loved ones. Relief workers compiled lists of survivors, posting names on bulletin boards and broadcasting them on the radio. The waiting was agonizing. Parents who had lost track of children in the chaos sat by radios for hours, listening for names that might never be called. In Louisville, a young boy named Samuel Tucker had become separated from his family during the evacuation. Samuel was 8 years old, small for his age, with a quiet manner that made adults overlook him in a crowd. When the water reached his family's home in the Portland neighborhood, his mother had gathered the children and rushed toward higher ground. In the confusion, Samuel had fallen behind. By the time his mother noticed he was missing, the water was too deep to return. Samuel spent 3 days alone in a church shelter, too frightened to speak to the strangers around him. He did not know the name of the shelter or the street it was on. He knew only that his mother had told him to find a church if he got lost, and he had found one. He sat in a corner of the church basement, wrapped in a blanket donated by the Red Cross, and waited for someone to come. On the 4th day, a volunteer named Catherine Holmes noticed the quiet boy in the corner. Catherine was a retired school teacher who had come to help in the shelters. She had seen hundreds of children in the past week, most of them crying or frightened or demanding their parents. But Samuel was different. He sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the door, waiting with a patience that seemed almost unnatural for a child his age. Catherine knelt beside him and asked his name. Samuel whispered it, his voice barely audible. She asked where his family lived. Samuel described the house, the street, the landmarks he remembered. Catherine wrote down every detail and promised to help him find his mother. It took 2 more days, but Catherine kept her promise. She contacted relief workers, police officers, and radio stations. She searched shelter lists and refugee camps. And finally, on the 6th day, she found Margaret Tucker's name on a list of evacuees at a school on the city's east side. When Samuel saw his mother running toward him across the church basement, he did not cry out or run to meet her. He simply stood up, let the blanket fall from his shoulders, and waited. Margaret swept him into her arms and held him so tightly that he could barely breathe. She was sobbing, repeating his name over and over. Samuel still did not cry. But later, when they were alone, when the shelter had gone quiet and his mother had finally fallen asleep beside him, Samuel wept. He wept for the fear he had felt, for the loneliness, for the home they had lost. He wept because he was finally safe. Stories like Samuel's unfolded across the Ohio Valley in the weeks after the flood. They were stories of loss and reunion, of grief and resilience, of ordinary people discovering extraordinary strength. Each story carried its own weight, its own particular sorrow, but together they formed a collective memory that would shape the region for generations. The flood of 1937 became a dividing line in the history of the Ohio Valley. Everything was measured against it. People spoke of before the flood and after the flood as if the disaster had cleaved time itself in 2. Children who had been too young to remember the flood grew up hearing stories from their parents and grandparents. They learned the watermarks that had been painted on buildings to show how high the river had risen. They visited the monuments and memorials that were erected in the years that followed. They inherited a memory that was not their own, but that belonged to them nonetheless. In Shawneetown, Illinois, the flood brought a reckoning that would transform the town completely. The small river community had flooded repeatedly throughout its history, suffering major inundations in 1884, 1913, and several times before. Each time the residents had rebuilt in the same location, trusting the levees, believing that the next flood would not be as bad. But the flood of 1937 was worse than anything Shawneetown had ever experienced. The entire town was submerged. Every building was damaged or destroyed. The residents, many of whom had already been impoverished by the Depression, lost everything they owned. When the waters finally receded, they faced a terrible choice: rebuild in the same vulnerable location or move the entire town to higher ground. The debate was fierce and painful. Some residents argued that Shawneetown had stood in the same spot for more than a century and should remain there. They said the flood was a once-in-a-lifetime event, that it would not happen again, that the town's history and identity were tied to its location. Others argued that the pattern of flooding was clear, that staying in the floodplain was foolish, that the only sensible choice was to move. In the end, the decision was made by the federal government. The Works Progress Administration, one of the New Deal agencies created to combat the Depression, offered to build a new town on higher ground 3 miles from the original site. The government would construct homes, businesses, streets, and utilities. The residents would have to leave their old town behind, but they would have a new beginning, safe from the river's fury. Most of Shawneetown's residents accepted the offer. Over the next 2 years, they moved to the new site, which was officially named New Shawneetown. The old town was largely abandoned, its buildings left to decay, its streets reclaimed by weeds and brush. A few stubborn residents stayed behind, refusing to leave the homes where they had been born. But most of the community started over, building new lives on the bluffs above the river. The story of Shawneetown became a symbol of the flood's lasting impact. It showed that some disasters are too great to overcome in place, that sometimes survival requires not just rebuilding, but relocating. It also showed the power of collective action, of communities coming together to make difficult decisions for the common good. If this story is touching something deep inside you, if you feel the weight of what these people endured, then take a moment to leave a comment below. Say these words: "Their courage inspires me." Say it for the families who lost everything and found a way to keep going. Say it for yourself because you understand what it means to face the impossible and still find hope. Chapter 4. A Nation Responds. The flood of 1937 was not just a regional disaster. It was a national emergency that demanded a national response. And slowly, sometimes painfully, that response came. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had been inaugurated just 4 years earlier, in the depths of the Great Depression. His New Deal programs had put millions of Americans back to work, building roads and bridges, dams and schools, parks and post offices. But the New Deal had not been designed for disaster relief. There was no Federal Emergency Management Agency in 1937, no coordinated system for responding to catastrophic events. When the Ohio River began to rise, the federal government was unprepared. The American Red Cross stepped into the breach. The organization, founded by Clara Barton in 1881, had been responding to disasters for more than half a century. It had developed systems for providing food, shelter, clothing, and medical care to disaster victims. And when the scope of the Ohio Valley flood became clear, the Red Cross mobilized the largest relief operation in its history. More than 3,000 Red Cross workers deployed to the flood zone. They established shelters in every affected community, providing temporary housing for hundreds of thousands of evacuees. They distributed millions of dollars in relief supplies, blankets, clothing, food, medicine, and household goods. They operated field hospitals and first aid stations, treating injuries and preventing the spread of disease. They reunited separated families, located missing persons, and provided counseling to those traumatized by the disaster. The Red Cross was not alone. Religious organizations, civic groups, labor unions, and private businesses all contributed to the relief effort. Churches opened their doors to refugees. Factories donated supplies. Workers volunteered their time and labor. The disaster brought out the best in American society, demonstrating a capacity for compassion and solidarity that transcended differences of class, race, and region. But the relief effort also revealed troubling disparities. African American flood victims often received inferior treatment in segregated shelters. They were given less food, worse accommodations, and fewer resources. In some communities, black families were turned away from shelters entirely and forced to find their own housing. The racism that pervaded American society did not disappear in the face of disaster. If anything, the flood exposed it more starkly. Civil rights leaders and black newspapers documented these inequities and demanded change. The Pittsburgh Courier, one of the nation's leading African-American newspapers, published detailed accounts of discrimination in flood relief. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People sent investigators to the flood zone and issued reports on the unequal treatment of black victims. These efforts helped shame relief agencies into providing more equitable assistance and laid groundwork for the civil rights struggles that would follow in subsequent decades. The federal government's response, though initially slow, eventually became substantial. President Roosevelt visited the flood zone in early February, touring the devastated communities and meeting with survivors. He promised federal assistance for rebuilding and directed government agencies to accelerate their efforts. The Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and other New Deal agencies deployed thousands of workers to the Ohio Valley, helping with cleanup, reconstruction, and flood control. The Army Corps of Engineers, which had been working on flood control projects throughout the Mississippi Valley, intensified its efforts in the wake of the disaster. Engineers studied the flood patterns, analyzed the levee failures, and developed plans for a comprehensive system of dams, reservoirs, and improved levees that would reduce the risk of future flooding. These plans would take decades to implement, but they represented a fundamental shift in the nation's approach to flood control. In Congress, the disaster prompted new legislation and new funding. The Flood Control Act of 1938 authorized billions of dollars for flood control projects throughout the nation. It established new standards for levee construction and required the Army Corps of Engineers to develop comprehensive flood management plans for every major river system. The law represented a recognition that flood control was a national responsibility, not just a local one, and that the federal government had a duty to protect its citizens from natural disasters. The flood also accelerated changes in disaster preparedness and emergency management. The chaotic response to the Ohio Valley flood demonstrated the need for better coordination, clearer lines of authority, and more systematic planning. In the years that followed, government agencies at all levels began developing emergency management protocols and building the institutional capacity to respond to future disasters. These efforts would eventually lead to the creation of FEMA in 1979, but the seeds were planted in the aftermath of the 1937 flood. Beyond the institutional changes, the flood transformed the way Americans thought about natural disasters. Before 1937, floods were often seen as local problems, the responsibility of the communities that experienced them. The Ohio Valley flood demonstrated that disasters of this magnitude were beyond the capacity of any single community or even any single state to manage. They required a coordinated national response and a recognition that all Americans had a stake in helping their fellow citizens recover. This shift in thinking was part of a broader transformation in American society during the New Deal era. The Great Depression had already demonstrated that individual and local resources were insufficient to address major economic crises. The flood reinforced that lesson, showing that natural disasters, like economic disasters, required collective action and government intervention. The era of rugged individualism was giving way to an era of shared responsibility. In the small towns and cities of the Ohio Valley, these grand themes played out in intimate, personal ways. Neighbors helped neighbors rebuild. Churches organized work parties to clean out flooded homes. Businesses extended credit to customers who had lost everything. Teachers welcomed students back to schools that had been used as shelters just weeks before. The fabric of community life, torn by the flood, was slowly, painstakingly rewoven. A hardware store owner in Huntington, West Virginia, named Robert Patterson, became a symbol of this communal spirit. Robert's store had been flooded, his inventory destroyed, his building damaged. He could have closed his doors and walked away. Instead, he reopened within a week of the water's recession, selling salvaged goods at cost and extending interest-free credit to families who needed supplies to rebuild their homes. Robert explained his decision simply. He said that his neighbors had supported him through the hard years of the Depression, and now it was his turn to support them. He said that a community was only as strong as the bonds between its members, and that those bonds were tested in times of crisis. He said that giving up was not an option, that the only way forward was together. Robert's store became a gathering place for the community during the long months of rebuilding. Residents would stop by not just to buy supplies, but to share news, exchange stories, and offer encouragement. The store became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even the worst disasters could not destroy the human capacity for kindness and solidarity. Chapter 5. The long road back recovery from the flood was measured not in days or weeks but in months and years. The physical damage was immense, and repairing it required enormous effort and resources. But the psychological damage was equally profound, and it could not be repaired with lumber and nails. Many survivors struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress. They had nightmares about rising water. They flinched at the sound of rain on the roof. They felt anxious and unsettled, unable to relax even in their rebuilt homes. The term post-traumatic stress disorder did not exist in 1937, and there was little understanding of the psychological impact of disasters. Survivors were expected to put the flood behind them and move on with their lives. Many did, but the scars remained. Children were particularly affected. Young people who had experienced the terror of rising water, the chaos of evacuation, the uncertainty of displacement, carried those experiences with them into adulthood. Some became anxious about storms and floods for the rest of their lives. Others developed a fierce determination to prepare for disaster, to never be caught unprepared again. The flood shaped their characters in ways they did not fully understand until much later. In Louisville, a girl named Elizabeth Foster was 12 years old when the flood destroyed her family's home in the Portland neighborhood. Elizabeth's father had worked at a factory near the river, and her mother had taken in laundry to supplement the family's income. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, and Elizabeth had grown up feeling secure in her modest surroundings. The flood swept all of that away. Elizabeth's family lost their home, their possessions, and their livelihood. Her father's factory was destroyed and never reopened. The family spent months in a cramped apartment, dependent on relief supplies and the charity of relatives. Elizabeth watched her parents struggle, saw the worry in their faces, felt the tension in their voices. She understood, in a way she had not before, how fragile security could be. Elizabeth vowed that she would never be so vulnerable again. She worked her way through high school, taking jobs after school and on weekends. She won a scholarship to college, the first in her family to attend. She became a social worker, dedicating her career to helping families in crisis. She often said that the flood had set the direction of her life, that it had taught her the importance of helping others when they were at their most vulnerable. Stories like Elizabeth's were common throughout the Ohio Valley. The flood became a formative experience for an entire generation, shaping their values, their careers, and their relationships. It taught them lessons about resilience and community that they carried with them throughout their lives and passed on to their children. The physical reconstruction of the flooded region was a massive undertaking that employed thousands of workers and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Homes had to be rebuilt or repaired. Businesses had to be restored. Infrastructure had to be replaced. The work went on for years, transforming the landscape of the Ohio Valley in ways both visible and invisible. Many communities took the opportunity of rebuilding to improve their flood defenses. Levees were strengthened and raised. Drainage systems were upgraded. Building codes were revised to require more flood-resistant construction. Some communities, like Shawneetown, relocated entirely to higher ground. Others made incremental improvements that reduced their vulnerability to future flooding. The federal government invested heavily in flood control projects throughout the region. The Army Corps of Engineers built dams on the tributaries of the Ohio, creating reservoirs that could store excess water during heavy rains. They constructed flood walls and improved levees along the main stem of the river. They developed sophisticated forecasting systems that could provide earlier warning of rising water. These projects took decades to complete, but they fundamentally changed the relationship between the Ohio Valley and its river. The economic recovery was slower and more uneven. Some communities bounced back quickly, their economies revived by reconstruction spending and pent-up demand. Others struggled for years, their industrial bases destroyed, their populations diminished by outmigration. The flood accelerated changes that were already underway in the regional economy, hastening the decline of some industries while creating opportunities for others. For many families, the economic impact of the flood was permanent. They never recovered the wealth they had lost. They never rebuilt the businesses that had been destroyed. They spent the rest of their lives in circumstances reduced from what they had known before. The flood was not just a temporary setback, but a fundamental break in their economic trajectory. Yet even in the midst of hardship, there were moments of grace and unexpected blessing. Families that had been estranged for years came together in the face of crisis. Couples whose marriages had been strained found new appreciation for each other. Children who had never known the value of what they had learned to cherish the simple things: a dry bed, a warm meal, a roof that did not leak. A farmer in southern Indiana named Walter Hensley lost his entire crop to the flood, along with most of his livestock and equipment. Walter was 53 years old and had been farming the same land for 3 decades. The flood seemed like the end of everything he had worked for. But as he surveyed the damage, as he calculated the losses, he felt something unexpected, a sense of relief. Walter had been struggling for years, burdened by debt and worn down by the relentless demands of farm life. The flood, terrible as it was, offered him a way out. He could take the relief money, sell the damaged land and start over somewhere else. He could give up the farm that had never quite prospered and find a new path. Walter and his wife moved to Indianapolis, where he found work in a factory. It was not the life he had imagined, but it was a good life, steadier and less uncertain than farming. His children grew up in the city, attended good schools, found opportunities that would not have been available in rural Indiana. Looking back years later, Walter said that the flood had been the worst thing and the best thing that ever happened to him. It had destroyed his old life, but it had also set him free. Chapter 6. What the Waters Left Behind. The Ohio River returned to its banks in February of 1937, but the flood never truly ended. Its waters receded, but its legacy remained, written into the landscape and the memory of everyone who lived through it. In the years that followed, the people of the Ohio Valley erected monuments and memorials to commemorate the disaster. They painted high water marks on buildings, showing future generations how high the river had risen. They named streets and parks after heroes of the flood, the rescuers and volunteers who had saved lives and rebuilt communities. They told stories around dinner tables and in classrooms, passing the memory of the flood from parents to children to grandchildren. The flood became part of the region's identity, a shared experience that bound communities together across state lines and generations. People who had lived through it felt a special kinship with each other, a bond forged in the crucible of disaster. They understood things that outsiders could not fully grasp: the terror of rising water, the desperation of evacuation, the slow agony of recovery. But the flood was more than a memory. It was also a warning, a reminder of the power of nature and the limits of human control. The Ohio River would flood again. It would rise in 1945, in 1964, in 1997, and at other times in between. Each flood would test the defenses that had been built after 1937. Each flood would remind the people of the valley that they lived beside a force that could never be fully tamed. The great flood control projects of the mid-20th century did their job. The reservoirs and levees and flood walls built by the Army Corps of Engineers prevented catastrophic flooding on the scale of 1937. The region was never again submerged the way it had been that terrible January. But the protection was not absolute. Local flooding still occurred. Rivers still overtopped their banks during heavy rains. The danger was reduced, but not eliminated. And in some ways, the flood control projects created new problems. By making the floodplain safer, they encouraged development in areas that had once been avoided. Communities expanded into low-lying areas, building homes and businesses in places that would have been underwater in 1937. When floods did occur, the damage was often greater than it would have been if the land had remained undeveloped. This pattern, replicated across the country, came to be known as the levee paradox. By reducing the frequency of flooding, levees encouraged development that increased the potential damage when floods did occur. The protection became a trap, luring people into a false sense of security that left them more vulnerable to the inevitable next disaster. The people of the Ohio Valley knew this truth in their bones, even if they did not always act on it. The memory of 1937 was too fresh, too vivid, too deeply embedded in the regional consciousness. Older residents warned their children and grandchildren about building too close to the river. They told stories of the flood, of the devastation it had caused, of the lives it had destroyed. They tried to pass on the hard-won wisdom of their experience. But memory fades, and each generation must learn its lessons anew. The children of the flood survivors grew up hearing the stories, but they had not lived through the terror themselves. Their children heard less, and their grandchildren heard less still. The high water marks on the buildings faded and were sometimes painted over. The monuments were passed without notice. The living connection to the disaster weakened with each passing year. And yet the river remained. It flowed past the cities and towns of the Ohio Valley, placid and beautiful most of the time, a source of recreation and commerce and civic pride. People picnicked on its banks, boated on its waters, watched its currents sparkle in the summer sun. They loved the river, even knowing what it could do. In Paducah, Kentucky, a flood wall was built after 1937, a massive concrete barrier designed to hold back the river's worst. On the city side of the wall, life went on as normal. Shops opened and closed, children went to school, families gathered for holidays and celebrations. The river was out of sight, beyond the wall contained, but the residents of Paducah never forgot what lay on the other side. They knew that the wall was not a guarantee, that it could be overtopped or undermined or simply overwhelmed. They maintained it carefully, inspecting it regularly, repairing any cracks or weaknesses. They practiced for the next flood, running drills and updating plans. They lived with the river, beside the river, but never in denial of its power. This was perhaps the most important legacy of the flood of 1937, a respect for nature that was earned through suffering. The people of the Ohio Valley learned that they could not simply conquer the river. They could work with it, manage it, prepare for it, but they could never control it completely. The river would always have the final word. The flood taught another lesson too, one that resonated beyond the Ohio Valley and beyond the question of natural disasters. It taught that communities are built not just on physical infrastructure, but on bonds of trust, cooperation, and mutual aid. The survivors of the flood did not make it through alone. They depended on each other, on neighbors and strangers who became neighbors, on the countless small acts of kindness and courage that made survival possible. That lesson was perhaps the most enduring legacy of all. In the decades that followed, when other disasters struck, when hurricanes and tornadoes and earthquakes tested other communities, the spirit of the Ohio Valley flood survivors lived on. It lived on in the volunteers who rushed to help. It lived on in the communities that came together. It lived on in the understanding that we are all connected, that what hurts one of us hurts all of us, and that together we can endure what none of us could survive alone. The last survivors of the flood of 1937 are gone now, passed into memory, like the flood waters themselves. But their stories remain, the stories of Martha Jennings, who refused to leave her home until the water rose too high, of Helen Cartwright, who carried her children through flooded streets to safety, of George Sullivan, who spent a night trapped in a factory, listening to the river rage below, of Anton Brower, who lost his shop but not his spirit, of Samuel Tucker, who waited 6 days for his mother to find him, of Elizabeth Foster, who turned her experience of loss into a lifetime of service. These stories, and thousands more like them, form the collective memory of the flood. They remind us of what was lost and what was saved, of the terrible price that was paid and the remarkable resilience that endured. They remind us that we are part of something larger than ourselves, connected to the past and responsible to the future. The Ohio River still flows, as it has for millennia, as it will for millennia to come. It flows past the cities that were drowned and rebuilt, past the monuments and markers, past the places where people suffered and struggled and ultimately survived. The river remembers nothing. It is just water, just current, just the endless movement of molecules toward the sea. But we remember. We remember because the stories have been passed down, because the lessons have been learned, because the scars still mark the landscape and the spirit of the Ohio Valley. We remember because memory is how we honor those who came before us. We remember because memory is how we prepare for what is yet to come. The most devastating flood of 1937 drowned the Ohio Valley and challenged all of America. It took lives and destroyed property. It tested the limits of human endurance and the capacity of communities to survive. But it also revealed the strength that lies within ordinary people, the courage that emerges in extraordinary times, the bonds that hold us together when everything else is swept away. That is the story of the flood. That is what the waters left behind. Not just destruction, not just loss, but also memory and hope, and the unshakable conviction that together we can endure. If you watched this far, it is because this story touched something deep inside you. It is because you understand what it means to face the impossible and keep going. Leave a comment below saying, "I watched this far so I can get to know you." So I can know who really cares about the stories on this channel, who truly values the lessons of history. And if this story moved you, if it made you think or feel or remember, please hit the like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story, someone who might find strength in the courage of those who came before us. And if you have not already, subscribe to this channel and click the bell so you never miss another story. The waters of 1937 have long since returned to the sea, but the memory remains. And as long as we remember, as long as we tell these stories, the courage and resilience of the Ohio Valley survivors will never be forgotten. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering.